To give context to previous presentations, by the end of the Civil Rights Movement, it had been only 2 generations since the end of the Indian Wars and conquest of Puerto Rico. 1 generation since Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Americans had suffered segregation and discrimination, and 3 generations since the end of slavery. So not much time had passed at all. Many in the Civil Rights Movement had older relatives who remembered the attempted genocides by federal and state governments. Family conservations kept alive the spirits of resistance from earlier struggles. While many European Americans might have forgotten that California and other Western lands were taken from Mexico, most Mexican and Mexican American families did not forget. While others might have forgotten about the Trail of Tears and the Indian Wars, most Native American families did not forget. While many Americans did not recognize that Puerto Rico was a captured territory of the United States, Puerto Rican families did not forget. While many Americans had confused images of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean Americans, families of these victimized groups continued to tell stories of internment camps, school segregation, and discrimination. The Great Civil Rights Movement confronted traditional opposition to integration and to protection of minority cultures and languages. In the 1950s, integration efforts resulted in the killing of civil rights workers, church bombings, and race riots.
During this time, civil rights was not an isolated topic solely belonging to the United States. This was actually a global issue that was happening around the world. What was interesting is the motivation behind the United States' actions during this time. The U.S. was actually one of the nations that waited to make a move on the issue. Even when they did, it was not because they felt a duty to the citizens of their nation. They were not at the forefront of this shift, and this caused more problems for them down the road. It is important to remember that during this time, the Cold War was also occurring with the Soviet Union. With the global movement for civil rights, it would have looked horrible on the U.S.'s part if they did not show that they cared for their people. It was at this point that the United States decided to do something. They needed to save face with the rest of the world, particularly the Soviet Union. As a part of the push for civil rights for people, it was believed that one of these rights should be a quality education for everyone. As a result, in 1960, the United Nations developed the Convention Against Discrimination in Education. This was a major shift in how education was seen and used in the world. It was then decided that no matter what, every human being deserved an education as a right, not a privilege. One of the most important aspects of this convention was in Article 1. It was here that a clear definition of discrimination was laid out and defined. However, this was not a fix-all solution like it was made out to be. A section of Orr's textbook showed parallelism with Springs. The discrepancies between black and white citizens continued, especially in the area of education. Due to Plessy versus Ferguson, there was a solid belief that schools could be separate but still remain equal. However, it was quickly realized that this was not the case. The NAACP, or National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, played a tremendous role in the well-known Brown versus Board of Education. The NAACP provided the legal counsel for the families filing lawsuits against the schools, in this example, Brown. The NAACP made an initial push with Charles Hamilton Houston at the helm as chief counsel for the organization. He pushed the line of separate but equal as much as possible without crossing it. Houston proposed an equalization strategy for schools, and on paper it looked good. However, it was quickly realized as an impossible goal. It essentially meant cities were supporting and maintaining twice as many schools since they continued to separate whites and blacks. Cities couldn't afford the financial strain of this, and the black schools drew the short stick. Houston then was able to use this to his advantage, winning several smaller cases. Then Thurgood Marshall took his place and steered the ship in Brown versus Board of Education, collecting one of the greatest victories we've ever seen. But this was not the turning point everyone believed it would be. Following this, schools were dragging their feet on integration, and some flat out refused. This continued and catalyzed the formation of large-scale civil rights movements in the late 50s and early 60s. Because of these demonstrations, the federal government was forced to get involved. The most common instance being when President Eisenhower moved military into Little Rock to oversee integration in a high school. Schools then felt threatened that they were losing control to the federal government. This then resulted in more pushback against integration. All of this led to the many of the well-known civil rights demonstrations and iconic figures in civil rights that we know and still discuss today.
The well-known incident that launched Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights activities was the December 1st, 1955 refusal by Rosa Parks, who worked as a seamstress in a leading Montgomery, Alabama department store, to give up her seat to white passengers. When Rosa Parks refused, she was arrested. The black ministers in the community quickly organized in response to this incident, and on December 5th, the Montgomery bus boycott began. The bus boycott lasted for over a year and finally ended on December 21st, 1956, when, after a Supreme Court decision against segregation on buses, the Montgomery transit system was officially integrated. King emerged from the struggle a national civil rights hero. After the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed, boycotts and nonviolent demonstrations occurred throughout the South. And on May 17th, 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his first national address in Washington, D.C., telling his audience, "Give us the ballot, and we will quietly, lawfully, and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the May 17th, 1954 decision of the Supreme Court." For King, meaningful school desegregation depended on the power of the black voter. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 extended federal power into areas of voting rights, public accommodations, education, and employment. Titles 4 and 6 of the legislation were intended to end school segregation and provide authority for implementing the Brown decision. Title 6, the most important section, established the president for using distribution of government money as a means of controlling educational policies. And in its final form, Title 6 states that no person, on the basis of color, race, or national origin, can be excluded from or denied the benefits of any program receiving federal financial assistance. And it requires all federal agencies to establish guidelines to implement this policy. Termination efforts met stiff resistance from Indian and white civil rights activists. Resisting termination policies, Native Americans demanded self-determination of tribal policies. And after the 1960 election of John F. Kennedy, his administration agreed. One of the results of the drive for self-determination was the 1966 opening of the Rough Rock Demonstration School. This school was built in Arizona on a Navajo reservation. The school was a joint effort of the Office of Economic Opportunity and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. At the school, Navajo parents controlled their children's education. The school worked to preserve the Navajo language and culture. In contrast to the deculturalization efforts of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the goal of learning Navajo and English was presented as a means of preparing children to fend successfully in both cultures and see the Navajo way as a part of a universal system of values. Native American self-determination was aided by the development of a pan-Indian movement based on the assumption that Native American tribes shared a common set of values and interests. Similar to the role played by CORE and SCLC among African Americans, pan-Indian organizations such as the American Indian Movement and the Indians of all tribes led demonstrations demanding self-determination. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, federal administrations supported Indian demands for self-determination. And during Richard Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign, it was clear they had his support. Native Americans' demands for bilingual and bicultural education were aided by the passage of Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1968, or what is more commonly known as the Bilingual Education Act. The legislation was also supported by Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans. Native Americans used funds from the legislation to support bilingual programs in Indian languages and English. The Bilingual Education Act provided support for bilingual programs in Navajo and English at the previously mentioned Rough Rock Demonstration School. The 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act gave tribes the power to contract with the federal government to run their own education and health programs. The legislation opened with the declaration that it was an act to provide maximum Indian participation in the government and education of Indian people, to provide for the full participation of Indian tribes in programs and services conducted by the federal government. The legislation provided that in local school districts receiving funds for the education of Indian students that did not have a school board having a majority of Indians, the district had to establish a separate local committee composed of parents of Indian students in the school. This committee was given the authority over any Indian education programs contracted with federal guidance. The 1988 Tribal Controlled Schools Act strengthened the principles of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Beside the right to operate schools under federal contract as provided in the 1975 legislation, the Tribally Controlled Schools Act provided outright grants to tribes to support the operation of their own schools.
Asian immigration hit its original boom in the 1850s. During this time frame and many decades to come, they were met with large opposition by the white majority. In the 1960s, the image began to change and the Asian American became the symbol of the model minority in American culture. Books like William Peterson's Japanese American Oppression and Success highlighted the success of Japanese Americans, but also attempted to demean other minorities, mainly African Americans. Peterson's book highlighted that Japanese Americans thrived well in American society without any real aid or assistance from the government. Harry Catino's Evolution of a Subculture focused on how Asian Americans were testing higher than white Americans and were having success in American culture. Despite being highly successful in schools, many Asian Americans still had to struggle for equality in the workforce. Many Asian Americans were positioned in low-paying white-collar jobs and never really were put in positions of power. Despite being highly successful in American schools, many non-English speaking Asian immigrants were still struggling in our school system. The court case Lau versus Nichols, for example, highlighted that schools should have been making every attempt to provide any non-English speaking student with the proper education so they can compete with the English speaking students. Despite the Supreme Court decision in 1974 for schools to have special programs for these students, very little changed. For example, in San Francisco in the 1970s, only 1 out of every 4 non-English speaking students received any help with English. The struggle for equality in education for Hispanic students had been decades long. In 1946, in the case of Mendez versus Westminster School District of Orange County, the state of California made it illegal to segregate the students due to their Hispanic heritage. In a previous decision in 1935, the rationale behind the segregation was that all Hispanic students should have been considered as Native Americans. A similar decision was made in Texas in the case of Delgado versus Bastrop Independent School District, which banned segregation in the state due to it being illegal and discriminatory to the students. Civil rights groups like the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund began to fight different forms of segregation throughout Texas in 1968. With Brown versus the Board of Education specifically focusing on African American students, many Hispanic students still struggle with segregation. It was not until Cisneros versus Corpus Christi Independent School District decision in 1970 they were granted the same rights.
Okay, we're going to discuss now we're going to discuss. So I'm